Episode 15, Calm Before the Storm, 150 to 159 AD. Hello and welcome back to 202 Decades. Before we get started, let me just ask you frequent listeners to please take a moment to subscribe to the show wherever you are listening. Whether that's on a podcast app or YouTube, subscribing along with rating and reviewing really helps this project to continue and grow. Thanks for all of your support. Last time, we rested in the glow of the peace of Pius. While the benevolence, justice, and stability of Antoninus Pius had not created the Pax Romana, it did maintain it. Troubles on the edges of the empire caused a few ripples of disturbance, but little occurred worth mentioning in the Senate's gossip. The empire flourished. The population grew. And this decade, we get more of the same. But unlike last decade, if you look really hard at the edge of the horizon, you might just be able to make out a hint of storm clouds in the distance, to the north and to the east. Here's what we're covering this time. Part 1, Setting and Background. Part 2, Main Characters. Part 3, Novel Works. Part 4, The Christians and the Sun. Part 1, Setting and Background. Like last time, but to an even greater degree, I have few occurrences to cover. In general, there was peace and prosperity across the provinces. If you were to pick a best time to live in the Roman Empire, you would have a difficult time finding a better period to live in than the reigns of Hadrian or Antoninus. Also, like last time, trouble in northern Britannia provides us something substantial to discuss. The Antonine Wall had been completed by 145, guarding the northern border of the territory Antoninus' governor Urbicus had just conquered. The lands between the two walls, Hadrian's and the Antonine, remained wild. The tribes living between the walls and those just north of the Antonine Wall resisted Romanization. In 154, there was trouble at the new wall. British tribes jumped the ditch and climbed over the wall. The soldiers protecting the wall were taken off guard. Rather than fighting, they retreated south and regrouped. The British tribes, the Brigantes may have taken part, went on to destroy several of the forts along the wall. After recovering from the initial shock of the invasion, the Romans regrouped and pacified the situation at the tip of a sword. By no later than 158, the Antonine Wall was again garrisoned and the destroyed forts rebuilt. The Romans found a unique but not unprecedented solution to the restless tribes of Britons. The troublemakers were packed up, carried by boat across the English Channel, and brought to modern southwest Germany. Their responsibility in exchange for their lives and their freedom was to defend the limes along the Neckar River in the Black Forest region. These transplants became a people apart from their neighbors and were given the name Bretones. There was also more of the same when it came to geologic activity. In early 152, a large earthquake struck the Aegean Sea, with its epicenter near northwest Anatolia. This wasn't far from the earthquake that struck the island of Rhodes last decade. By most accounts, though, this second earthquake in the region was more severe. The city of Mytilene on the island of Lesvos was nearly destroyed. Smyrna and Ephesus were thrown into confusion and terror. The city of Cyzicus was also rocked by the earthquake. Here was where Hadrian had ordered the construction of the largest temple of the ancient world. It had taken 16 years to complete, and work was finally finished in 139 AD. Just 13 years later, when the earthquake of 152 hit, the temple was nearly demolished. Work did soon begin to restore it. Destruction was widespread across the region, and the imperial family collaborated to ease the suffering, Antoninus was familiar with the area thanks to his tenure as governor of Asia. We hear of him personally funding baths in Ephesus. Marcus Aurelius was active in the restoration of Smyrna and in the province of Bithynia. The writer Pausanias, in his travelogue, references many presents of money given to the Greeks by Antoninus, and that he built many buildings in Ionia, meaning the western shore of Anatolia. A revolt broke out in Upper Egypt near the Red Sea around 153. Though the rebels were fairly small in number, any disturbance in Egypt was cause for concern. Egypt provided a huge amount of grain for the rest of the empire and also served as a crucial trading site between Rome and the Indian Ocean. Last time, I mentioned that Antoninus never left Italy for all of his reign. I may need to reel that remark back in, however, as it's not as cut and dry as I thought. One of our sources says he never left Italy. Two others, though, say that Antoninus visited Alexandria during this Egyptian revolt. In this telling, he was present for the ordering of construction on the gates of the sun and the moon, and for a new racecourse. If he did go to Alexandria, it was also to personally direct the campaign against the rebels. Ever since the Roman conquest of Egypt, no member of the senatorial class was allowed to visit Egypt without express permission from the princeps. Antoninus may have traveled there to prevent any prominent person sent there from the temptation of Egypt's riches. The revolt was easily taken care of, though, by a single legion, and the unrest did not spread. I remain skeptical that Antoninus really visited the East. Given his advancing age and the rough sea journey, it seems unlikely. But if we're to believe the writers Aristides and Malala, Antoninus visited Antioch. Besides repaving the roads there, he checked the ambition of a client king named Abgar, who ruled from Edessa and was beginning to attack nearby cities outside of Roman control. This was too provocative and risked upsetting the peace with Parthia. Before returning to Rome, if you believe he ever left, he and Marcus are said to have met and negotiated with the Parthian king Vologases IV. If you remember back to the 110s, when Trajan invaded Mesopotamia, the Parthians were divided between two kings, Chosroes in the west and Vologases in the east. After the Romans retreated, Vologases and Chosroes continued competing until 129, when Vologases finally overcame his relative. Good news for Vologases. The bad news was the fighting was not over. A new contender appeared named Mithridates, perhaps a brother of Chosroes. Mithridates competed with Vologases III for sole control of Parthia until 140, when Mithridates was defeated. The King of Kings, Vologases III, had been through a lot since his father died in 110. After decades of civil war, he finally enjoyed 7 years of sole rule. That was all he would get. In 147, the son of Mithridates prompted a coup and deposed Vologases III. This new king's name was Vologases IV. He was the Parthian king with whom Antoninus and Marcus met and negotiated in 154, if it happened. I know that was a lot of Parthian names to throw at you, but I wanted to update the happenings of Parthia since we last discussed them in the 110s. If you didn't follow all of that, in summary, Parthia had been divided for almost half a century, but now a king of kings named Vologases IV ruled the united Parthian Empire. We and the Romans will be hearing much more from Vologases IV and the Parthians next decade. Here is the first black cloud on the horizon. Part 2. Main Characters. Let's get an update on our cast. Our leading role is played by Antoninus Pius, of course. When this decade began, Antoninus was already 64 years old. As we discussed in the last section, he was far from inactive, perhaps even traveling to the east to quiet tensions there. This wasn't the norm for his reign. Antoninus usually relied on local administrators to solve problems. Throughout the 150s, we see Antoninus Pius deviating from his conservatism in a few notable ways. Most admirable of his innovations was in bettering the legal rights of slaves. We talked a bit about slavery during the end of century episode titled The First Century, Life in the Roman Empire, beginning at 39 minutes, 17 seconds, if you'd like to refresh yourself. In short, though, Roman slavery was usually, but not always, slightly less brutal than New World chattel slavery. But Roman slaves were still often the victims of violence and abuse. The service, the slave, was completely at the mercy of the dominus, the master. The dominus had legal authority of life and death over his slaves. They were property and had no legal rights. Until Antoninus gave them rights. That's a bit of an exaggeration, actually. Augustus and Claudius had both granted slaves very limited rights. First, to disallow forcing slaves to fight wild animals. Second, that if a sick slave was left out to be exposed to the elements, but survived, they would be emancipated. And third, that families of slaves should not be separated by their master. Another mercy of ancient slavery compared to New World slavery. These were all edge cases, rights applying to very specific circumstances. Antoninus' granting of rights applied more broadly. Antoninus granted that if a master killed his slave without sufficient reason, he would be punished as if he had killed another man's slave. This was not equal protection compared to a freedman or citizen, but still a deterrent for violent masters. Antoninus also prohibited slaves to be treated unnecessarily cruelly. If a slave felt he was being treated in an overly cruel manner, he could appeal to the proper authority, and the master would be forced to sell his slave. After these rulings of Antoninus, slaves still had miserable lives. Many quite literally worked to death in the mines. But at the least, they had a few legal rights to cling to, that they would not be put to death or treated exceedingly cruelly. Other legal reforms were also implemented. It was Antoninus who instituted the requirement that a man must be presumed innocent until proven guilty. Trials were also required to be local, taking place where the alleged crime occurred. These accommodations, which we take for granted in the legal system today, trace all the way back to the reign of the pious emperor. Now, we shouldn't imagine Antoninus sitting down and thinking through what laws he would like to change or make. The Historia Augusta asserts that he had the aid of experts in jurisprudence in these legal reforms. Still, Antoninus approved these legal reforms, and he should get credit for them. As the 150s wore on, Antoninus wore old. He turned 70 in 156 and is said to have grown feeble, nibbling on dry bread to give him energy for his morning receptions. His voice had grown hoarse and resonant but remained agreeable. For this decade, he remained of sound mind and continued to serve as the highest authority in the empire. It is true, though, that he increasingly leaned on Marcus Aurelius as his partner and heir. I don't normally evaluate an emperor while he's still living, but spoiler alert, since Antoninus will live only until 161, and since next decade will be packed with big events, now, in this less busy decade, is the time to talk about Antoninus and his legacy. So, was Antoninus a model of stability and prosperity, or was he a harbinger of decay and inflexibility? Last time, I made the case that Antoninus Pius was a conservative, and this time I've softened that stance with the legal reforms he made. I think what I appreciate most about Antoninus is his keeping what works going and ditching what was unsuccessful. He was not a tinkerer like Hadrian, nor a conqueror like Trajan. Antoninus was instead a careful, generous, and benevolent ruler, maintaining peace, rooting out corruption, a friend to all, whether senators or slaves, provincials or Italians. He is the kind of ruler and I think most of us, would prefer to live under. As I tried to communicate last time, I don't think the peace and prosperity can be wholly credited to Antoninus himself. But he didn't mess it up, which is surprisingly easy to do. Credit where credit is due. He didn't provoke any massive revolts like Hadrian did in the province formerly known as Judea, or Trajan did with the revolts in Cyrene, Egypt, and Cyprus. And he didn't instigate any major conflicts with outside powers. Some credit can also be given to Antoninus for prosperity. He limited the corruption of provincial officials, allowing the provinces to grow wealthy without having their flourishing siphoned away. Though less glamorous than the great temples of Hadrian, his construction projects were also practical. The improved roads facilitated commerce. The improved aqueducts made city life more pleasant and clean. His legal reforms are too often mentioned in passing. These were substantive changes which made the justice system more just. That they have stood the test of time, especially the presumption of innocence, is enough to demonstrate their obvious necessity and universality as concepts. On the flip side, though, there are indications that it was during his reign that legal double standards became codified, even among citizens, with the upper classes receiving more favorable justice than the peasants. These stratifications will grow and sharpen over the coming centuries. Like any ruler, he wasn't without flaws. Most commonly cited is his failure to deal with the growing threats on his eastern and northern frontiers. The growing storm clouds on these horizons would pour suffering on the Roman Empire during his successor's reign. If Antoninus had been more diligent in forming alliances with the Germans and Sarmatian tribes across the Rhine and the Danube, or if he would have been active in raiding into their territory, showing either friendship or strength, threats may have been prevented from growing into existential issues. Instead, the Roman Empire under Antoninus showed their barbarian neighbors to the north only concern, with the improvement of the defensive lines. Hindsight is 20/20 though. It's very hard to justify decisive action against a threat that hasn't yet materialized. It would have taken a real visionary to recognize the whispers across the river as a real danger. I don't think we should place too much of the blame of what's to come on Antoninus. Perhaps he could have done more, but his reign did ensure that when trouble came, the Romans weren't wholly unprepared. He, next decade, will successfully transfer power to his heir, who was well prepared for ruling. And the massive military operations Marcus will have to make will only be possible because of the frugality of Antoninus. The treasury was flush with cash thanks to him. If the disasters of the 160s struck a Roman Empire that lacked funds to defend itself, we would be talking about a very different and much worse future for Rome. I've given some big hints as to what's coming next decade, and as you might be able to tell, it will be a lot. War, plague, and invasion loom. We will need to dive right in. To save a little bit of time next decade, let's catch up with Marcus Aurelius and young Lucius Verus now. Marcus was 29 years old when the 150s began. As we've seen already, Marcus was increasingly active as an heir and as a Caesar, a term used more and more for the next person below the princeps. Last decade, Marcus had continued his tutelage under his teacher Fronto. Surviving letters between the two show that Marcus grew weary of the relentless training in Greek and Latin rhetoric offered by his tutor. His heart was drawn to philosophy and increasingly to Stoic teachings. Marcus Aurelius had served as consul in 140 and 145, but his activity really took off in 147 when he was granted the powers of imperium and tribunation. This came after Faustina, the wife of Marcus, gave birth to her first child, thus making Antoninus a grandfather. Throughout the 150s, Faustina was busy raising their children. This joy for the couple was also mixed with sadness, as 5 of their first 9 children died before the age of 5. Despite her preoccupation with children at this stage, she will become a powerful political player in the next decades. We saw that in 152, Marcus visited the province of Asia to help the recovery effort after the earthquake. In 153, Marcus served as quaestor. This office had a wide variety of functions, but was primarily concerned with management of finances. He also had the opportunity to hone his oratory skills by giving speeches before the Senate and reading letters from Antoninus when the princeps was absent. In 157, Maximus, the long-serving Praetorian prefect, died, and Marcus took up this role. More than just a military or security position, this post was deeply involved in administering. Plus, it ensured that when it was Marcus's time to rule, the Praetorian Guard would be on his side. I keep talking about Marcus, but I've only been mentioning Lucius in passing. If he was also an heir to Antoninus, why have I been passing over him? Partly because of his youth. Lucius Verus was only 19 years old in 150 AD. He had also been tutored by Fronto, and apparently was an excellent student. Lucius always had baser tastes than Marcus, though. Maybe that had to do with becoming a Caesar at such a young age. He was worldly, while Marcus had his head on ideas, philosophy over rhetoric. Marcus had served as consul in 146, but Lucius was deemed too young or too unprepared at that time. In 153, though, he joined Marcus in becoming a quaestor, and then became consul in 154. We'll see the differences between the two Caesars play out next decade as they begin to rule together. Part 3. Novel Works. The written word flourished during the reign of Antoninus Pius. Traditionally, the, quote, golden age of Latin literature is considered 81 BC to 17 AD, with Cicero, Ovid, and Virgil being the defining figures. According to the classicists, this period produced the best Latin work. Next, we have a Silver Age of Latin literature from 18 to 133 AD. The works of this period, while still superb, perhaps stand in too much reverence to the greats of the prior period and derive their style too much from Virgil or Cicero. In this period, we have Juvenal, Martial, Pliny the Elder, Pliny the Younger, there he is, Tacitus, Suetonius, Seneca, Quintilian, and Lucan. The period which follows this Silver Age doesn't have a specific name. Fewer of the great works in the 140s and 150s were penned in Latin. Following Hadrian's example, Greek gained prominence as the elite language of literature. The shift was not total. Much was still written in Latin. Notable among the Latin works of this age is a novel of an author named Lucius Apuleius titled Metamorphoses, but more commonly called The Golden Ass. Apuleius was of Numidian origin from the province of Africa in modern Algeria. The protagonist of his novel was also named Lucius and also from Numidia. The story recounts how, in seeking to experience flight like a bird, Lucius travels to various magicians. In the end, he drinks a potion which, instead of transforming him into a bird, turns him into a donkey. The rest of the novel tells of his trying and failing to turn back into a human, with a series of side stories told by characters Lucius meets. Imagine Kafka's Metamorphosis combined with the Canterbury Tales. This is the only surviving complete novel in Latin from ancient Rome. And then there was Aelius Aristides, an orator and author from Bithynia. His oratory skills were distinguished by their accuracy and fineness. Unlike most orators of the age, he didn't pride himself in speaking off the cuff. When Marcus Aurelius met Aristides in Smyrna, he asked him to demonstrate his speaking skills. He declined and said, "Propose the topic today, and tomorrow come and hear me, for I am not one of those who spew out their speeches, but try to make them perfect." The other side of the Aristides coin is a book he wrote called Sacred Tales, which recounts his deep sickness and then his healings by and visions of Asclepius, the god of healing. This work provides insight into a first-person pagan religious experience and the working of temple medicine in the ancient world. Next is an author I've mentioned a few times in the past decades, Pausanias. He put together a lengthy work titled Description of Greece. This had the purpose of providing an account of all things Greek. He begins with a description of the region of Attica and Athens, and then proceeds to describe the regions of the Peloponnese and then the regions north of Athens. Here's a short sample from a description in Athens. "Farther on is a temple of good fame, another offering from the spoils of the Persians who landed at Marathon in Attica. I surmise that this is the victory of which the Athenians were proudest. Even Aeschylus, in the prospect of death, though his reputation as a poet stood so high, and he had fought in the sea battles of Artemisium and Salamis, recorded nothing but his father's name, his own name, his city, and that the grove at Marathon and the Persians who landed in it were witnesses of his manhood." From this sample of Pausanias, you can see that his work is much more than a list of sights to see. Instead, it offers great detail, history, and cultural background. For anyone deeply interested in ancient Rome and Roman Greece, this description of Greece is a fine place to dive deeper. The great historians of the last generation, Plutarch, Tacitus, and Suetonius, were gone now. Taking up their mantle was Appian of Alexandria. He produced a grand history of Rome over 24 volumes from its founding up to Trajan's conquests. As I'm sure you're used to hearing by now, about half of this history has been lost. What remains primarily focuses on the time around Hannibal and the Second Punic War, as well as a detailed history of the civil wars in which Rome transformed from republic to principate. Last in our little book club is more nonfiction. Claudius Ptolemy was another author from Alexandria who focused not on history, but on astronomy, geography, and mathematics. Most influential of his contributions was the Almagest, his book on astronomy. Ptolemy here provides the only mathematically sound geocentric model of the cosmos. He theorized that the universe was a series of spheres within spheres, with Earth at its center. The celestial bodies extended out from the Earth. In order, they were the Moon, Mercury, Venus, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and finally, the stars. Through a complex series of tables, the calculations of Ptolemy allows one to make predictions of future movements of the celestial bodies. The difficulty in making these calculations in a geocentric system comes from the retrograde motion of some of the planets. What this means is that while all the celestial bodies follow the same course across the night sky, some of them occasionally drift in the opposite direction. To account for this, Ptolemy posited that Mercury and Venus moved in a perfect circle around a fixed point, and then this fixed point itself moved around the Earth in a fixed circle. Spheres within spheres within spheres. Showing's easier than telling here, but these circles in circles allow an explanation of why planets sometimes move backwards in the sky. So, if your horoscope requires you to calculate when Mercury will next be in retrograde, you can consult the charts of Ptolemy for your answer. Or may I suggest using the much simpler calculations available to us in our heliocentric, sun-centered model. The system perfected by Ptolemy remained in use for another 1,300 years in the Roman, Byzantine, Islamic, medieval, and Renaissance civilization, right up until Copernicus theorized that assuming the sun is at the center of the universe makes the calculations far simpler. Ptolemy is a big deal. If you're going to remember one of these writers, orators, historians, and scientists, make sure it's Ptolemy. Apart from Apuleius, these writers of the mid-2nd century all wrote in Greek. Greek was becoming the language in which culture was produced, even in Rome. North Africa, with its few Greek speakers and proximity to Italy, would retain a core of Latin literature, a feature it shared with much of the rest of the west of the empire, like Hispania, Gaul, and Britannia. The reach of Greek was never as strong in these regions. Part 4. The Christians and the Sun. Antoninus Pius, if you couldn't guess by his title, was very pious to the old gods. In reality, the pious, P-I-U-S, meant something closer to dutiful than our word pious, P-I-O-U-S, which takes more of a meaning of devout. Either title would have been applicable to him, though. Antoninus practiced an old-fashioned, quiet piety. Although his adopted son Marcus had embraced Stoic teachings, he could not help but admire the virtue and dedication of Antoninus. This didn't make Antoninus a hardliner. He allowed the various philosophical schools to continue their teachings uninterrupted. He even made accommodations for the Jews. Upon taking power, he reversed the most grievous of Hadrian's policies, those forbidding them from practicing their religion. He kept the prohibition on Jews from entering Aelia Capitolina, formerly Jerusalem, but allowed them to once again read the Torah and practice circumcision. When it came to the Christians, Antoninus was not an innovator. He continued the policies of Trajan in which Christians were not actively sought out, but were only punished if they were accused and found unwilling to repent. Later Christians remembered Antoninus as a ruler, along with Hadrian, who was kind to them. In the fragment of Cassius Dio's History of Antoninus, which was cobbled together by a Byzantine monk, it's recorded that Antoninus is admitted by all to have been noble and good, neither oppressive to the Christians nor severe to any of his other subjects. Instead, he showed the Christians great respect. This is certainly an introgression by the 11th century compiler. Even in the 4th century, though, the Christian historian Eusebius asserts that Antoninus was benevolent to the Christians. Perhaps this impression of Antoninus developed over time as the Christians began to face more active persecution. At least one notable and contemporary Christian of the 150s did not feel that Antoninus had their best interests in mind. Justin Martyr was a man of Greek origin who was born in the province of Judea around 100 AD. As he grew up, he bounced between the teachings of the Stoics and the Pythagoreans before settling on the teachings of Plato. Now in Ephesus, he chanced upon an old Syrian man with whom he struck up a conversation. This man was a Christian, and through their conversation, Justin became convinced that Christian doctrine held the answers he had been seeking all his life. He soon converted and hit the road, teaching and preaching his new faith, eventually making his way to Rome and starting his own school. Justin stands out for his integrating many of the concepts he learned as a follower of Plato to his new Christian faith. He also began to write. All but 3 of his works are lost. Most important for our story is his first apology. This is a written defense of Christianity addressed directly to the emperor, Antoninus Pius. The letter starts by boldly pointing out the unfairness of imperial policy to the Christians. On behalf of those of all nations who are unjustly hated and wantonly abused, myself being one of them. He says it is unjust that Christians are being persecuted merely for their name rather than for their conduct. He assures Antoninus that their conduct is good, and if it's occasionally not, that behavior is against their teachings and rightly deserves punishment. He brings up that Christians have been accused of atheism, a rejection of the gods. Justin argues that they deny the lower base gods in favor of a higher transcendent God, which is even the Logos, so often alluded to in Hellenistic philosophy. He spends the rest of the Apologia arguing for the goodness, the rationality, and the divine origin of the Christian faith. Justin's appeal is long, 68 chapters. And I can't imagine Antoninus' reaction at receiving on his desk this thick letter from a member of a fringe religious cult. One of Justin's lost works is a letter called Against Marcion. This Marcion was originally a shipwright from the northern Anatolian city of Sinope on the Black Sea. He both grew wealthy and became a Christian. In the 130s, he moved to Rome and joined the church there. Over the next decade or so, he departed from the mainstream views of the church in Rome, what we would call orthodoxy. In 144, his views were deemed to have departed so far from the leaders of the church that he was excommunicated. This is the first Christian heresy we're discussing, and of course the question of perspective must come up. Each side would have considered the other to be in error. When I talk about heresy, just know that I'm using that term historically from the perspective of Orthodox or Nicene Christianity, those Christians who won out over their rivals over the next few centuries. The primary difference between Marcion's view, called Marcionism, and orthodoxy is Marcion's belief that the God of the Old Testament, the God of the Jews, was not the same God as the one who had sent Jesus. His Christianity was thus totally separate from Judaism. He believed that the Old Testament God, whom he called the Demiurge, had created the physical world and was a small, petty god of law and punishment. In contrast, the God Jesus preached was a universal, transcendent God of love and compassion. This higher God was a God of pure spirit. In his beliefs, we see an early form of Gnosticism, a collection of Christian-adjacent sects who emphasized personal spiritual knowledge as the basis for salvation. For the Gnostics, the material world was low, base, and evil, while the spiritual world was higher, holy, and good. Enlightenment or salvation came from abandoning the physical and focusing on the spiritual. When Jesus came, according to Marcion and the Gnostics, his body had been merely an illusion. The divinity of Jesus couldn't have been corrupted by commingling with flesh. This belief in the unmingled spiritualness of Jesus is called Docetism. The rest of Christians, of course, believed that the God of the Jews was also the God of Jesus. They believed Jesus was not opposed to the Jewish scriptures, but a fulfillment of them. They believed the physical world is good but corrupted. And rather than being a mere illusion, they believed Jesus was both fully man and fully divine. We don't need to get sucked into this argument here. We'll have plenty of chances to discuss the battle between heresy and orthodoxy over the next several centuries. Maybe the most intriguing thing about Marcion is his list of Christian books he created for his followers. This is called Marcion's Canon. Canon being the term for a set of scriptures considered sacred and/or divinely inspired. 11 books are included. A story of Jesus' life and teaching called the Gospel of Marcion, along with 10 of Paul the Apostle's letter. The Gospel of Marcion bears strong resemblance to the New Testament Gospel of Luke, but without the passages connecting Jesus with the Old Testament. Marcion considered Paul the one true apostle, and as such, he did not include the other 9 letters in the New Testament attributed to other disciples of Jesus. The Canon of Marcion is the first list of Christian canon that we know of. It's not clear if this was the first list of Christian writings considered a scripture ever made, or if older lists just haven't survived. It's certainly possible that Marcion's list is oldest, because within the next few decades, Orthodox Christians became increasingly clear and consistent on what is and isn't canon, perhaps as a direct response to Marcion's list. The holding of certain writings of the apostles as sacred came before the lists. Clement of Rome, the fourth pope, who wrote a surviving letter in the late 90s, references between 10 and 13 books in the current Christian canon. And Justin Martyr references far more in the 150s. To skip ahead a few decades while on this topic, a document usually dated to the late 2nd century called the Muratorian Fragment provides a more fleshed out canon. It records 21 books as Christian scripture, compared to 27 in the modern New Testament canon. And the list specifically argues against a letter of Paul to the Laodiceans, which Marcion included in his canon as being a forgery and a fraud. I mentioned Clement of Rome as the fourth pope, just called the Bishop of Rome at this point in history. He lived during the 90s under Domitian. Skipping back to our decade, Anicetus of Syria was the Bishop of Rome, the 11th to hold the office. This was a dangerous job. Over half of his predecessors had been martyred. As you might expect for the head of the church in Rome, he spent a lot of energy combating the teachings of Marcion. But another focus of his was on the date of Easter. We don't need to get into the details, but there was a disagreement over the date between Rome and the churches of the province of Asia in modern Turkey. To try to resolve the issue of when to celebrate Easter, Anicetus hosted in Rome an old and towering figure from the province of Asia, Polycarp. According to tradition, Polycarp was a student of John the Apostle, the youngest of Jesus' 12 disciples. Because of his old age and connection to a disciple who knew Jesus, he was valued as an arbiter of Jesus' true teachings as opposed to heretics. A letter of his survives, written to the Christians in the city of Philippi in Greece. He too quotes at least 10 New Testament books as scripture and argues against heresy. He doesn't name Marcion specifically, but he calls out his Docetism by stating, "Whosoever does not confess that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is an antichrist." After returning home from Rome, Polycarp was brought before the crowd in the stadium of Smyrna and ordered to perform a sacrifice to the emperor. When he refused, he was burned at the stake. The fire grew, but did not burn him, so finally, Polycarp was stabbed through. The Christians collected his bones. An account of his death titled The Martyrdom of Polycarp from the late 2nd century has survived. It gives us the first account of the honoring of a saint's remains or possessions. "So we afterwards took up his bones, which are more valuable than precious stones, and finer than refined gold, and laid them in a suitable place, where the Lord will permit us to gather ourselves together." The death of Polycarp marked the tail end of the 2nd generation of Christians. There was no one left who could claim to have direct experience of the apostles' teaching. Christianity was still growing, slowly and steadily, but its growth brought with it disagreement and outside attention. When times were good, tolerance was the norm, and persecution was at a low level. But as war, plague, and invasion spread in the coming decades, the Christians will face more active persecution. Other faiths besides Christianity were also growing. One which gathered a wide audience in the coming centuries was Sol Invictus, meaning the unconquered sun. Our first datable reference to Sol Invictus comes in 158 AD in an inscribed dedication in Rome. This worship of the sun god Sol had its origins in Syria. It wasn't exactly a new cult. Sun gods can be found across the world in polytheistic religions, but its growth and popularity in Rome was something novel. It will soon be embraced by many in the army and even among emperors. The same hard times that brought persecution for the Christians also fueled conversion not just for Christianity, but to other fringe religious cults like Sol Invictus. For the next 2 centuries, Sol Invictus will eclipse the Christians in popularity. Religious expression seems to have begun to grow. When chaos surrounded the inhabitants of the Roman world following the Pax Romana, many turned their eyes upward to the heavens for answers. The dark clouds have gathered, and the rain is beginning to fall. That's it for this decade. Next time, Antoninus will die, Marcus and Lucius will become emperors, and the peace will end. War will break out against Parthia, a plague will ravage the Roman world, and the Germans will sweep across the rivers into Roman territory. As you can guess, it's going to be a big episode. In normal times, it would be difficult to research, write, record, and edit this in a timely manner, but these will not be normal times for my family. Mrs. 202 Decades and I are expecting our second child in mid-October of 2024. I'm going to race to get the next episode out before then, but it's very possible the show will be on a bit of hiatus as we adjust to life as a family of 4. Thank you for listening and all of your support. Please subscribe, rate, and review the show so it can continue to grow. At the moment, this is purely a passion project of mine, but I hope, with your help, for it to continue to grow into something more. Thanks again. And I will see you next time.